This one learning theory will for sure make you a millionaire. Let me explain, because I've literally applied the same principle slash theory my entire life, and I've basically achieved most of the things that I've wanted to achieve. Now let's talk about the social learning theory. Now the social learning theory derives from Albert Bandura, and it basically talks about the principle of learning, right? And learning is basically the consumption of information and knowledge and converting it into probable actions that will hopefully do some positive impacts when it comes to moving forward in your life. Now, when it comes to the social learning theory specifically by Albert, he talks about three core pillars or three specific principles. Now, the first is the modeling. So imagine, and you've probably seen this before, modeling is basically you reflecting the behavior of specific individuals. Now, we see the idea of modeling very often throughout parents. For example, when you see your sons or daughters, I don't know if your parents or not, but when they kind of reflect the same type of behavior and actions as you. And so you see that most predominantly in babies as well. For example, if you smile at a little baby, subconsciously it will literally smile at you back. And that's basically the idea of modeling within the social learning theory. Now, the second one is observational training. Now, this is actually really interesting. Now, what this theory or what this specific principle states is that you don't have to explicitly give somebody a specific instruction. For example, you are, a football coach and you're like explaining him, a specific, I don't know, exercise or drill. If you were to show it instead, the likelihood of him actually learning and implementing is much more effective than just explicitly explaining it. So in other words, actually demonstrating the specific type of action or attitude or even behavior is much more effective than essentially just observing and listening and actually like receiving the specific instruction. Now, the third core element is the reinforcement. Now, reinforcement is really, really important, because if you have read Atomic Habits, the book, it talks about reinforcement and how reinforcement is a very important element when it comes to establishing a habit. And reinforcement basically talks about the reward mechanism, right? And so we see that as the previous example with parents. If your son emulates a good behavior, a good attitude, same like you, for example, it's emulating a good characteristic of you, for example, I don't know, solving a stressful situation in a calm manner, you essentially reinforce it by, appreciating your son, saying, oh, well, that's a good job, you did really well, and just praising him in general gives him that specific dopamine or that specific reward mechanism in his brain that will enforce him to redo the habit again. So in more simpler terms, if you praise or positively reward your specific person or individual with a positive type of reward, then he or she is more likely to actually repeat that specific type of behavior. Now, when it comes to these three pillars, there's two specific, obviously there are 100 billions other more, but there are two specific side principles or side terminologies I want you guys to understand. The first one is the mirror neurons. Now, if you guys are studying biology or biological chemistry, you've probably heard about this very often. And mirror neurons basically talks about the biological chemistry of you literally, and I mean it quite literally, in your brain, firing off specific hormones that literally mirror and reflect the specific type of action or behavior that person is making. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the baby and the child, even if you smile at a baby, the baby's brain will essentially mirror and reflect, if not identically one-to-one to what that person is doing to that baby, smiling or frowning or even an angry face whatsoever. The second one is the attachment theory. Now, attachment theory is very often discussed for parenting. For example, if you are parents, as I stated that question earlier, you've probably heard about this theory before. But the idea of attachment theory is depending on your specific behaviors and your specific sets of attitudes, you can kind of predict this specific type of attachment characteristics your son will have. For example, if you're a very cold parent, if you never really, talk with your kids, or I don't know, you're not really there for them, I know it's an extreme example, then your son could grow up feeling anxious and having detachment tendencies. And so basically attachment theory, as I mentioned, is basically a sub-principle of the social learning theory. Now, why is this important? And why would this basically make me a millionaire? It's because of the following principle. Now, if you guys want to be a millionaire, it's very cliche to understand that in order for you to become one, you essentially gotta be like one, right? And so I mean that quite on a conscious as well as subconscious level, but you basically gotta emulate the specific type of personas and characteristics that they portray. Now you can do that essentially by obviously reading autobiographies, reading books, or literally studying the types of personality and characteristics there are. But essentially what you want to do is you want to emulate what a millionaire does. So emulate a millionaire. And as I mentioned, how you do that specifically is you literally got to study them. And that's why books and other online learning resources are really, really helpful, because you basically get to understand not only the type of life they live, but basically the way they are neurochemistry built, like the way their brain is basically hardwired to tackle the type of complex things that they face in their life. And so I want you guys to understand that this specific chain of sequence is how you got to understand in order for what you got to understand in order to emulate a person who's basically made it. Because I want you to understand that logically, if you behave, talk, speak, and do most of the things that a millionaire does, then quite logically you become one. No, I mean, because you're essentially doing everything that they're doing, and so how on earth will you not become who they are, right? A millionaire. And so in order for you to emulate a millionaire, I want you guys to understand that it mainly boils down to one thing. It is your belief system. And I'll probably make a separate video on belief system, because belief system is or has a lot of depth, because belief system is basically a set of value systems that you create for yourself, talking about behavior, characteristics, not only that, but the way you perceive reality, the way you have trust in religion, the way you have your understanding about money. Belief system is quite a complex term, right? So basically surface it to something more simpler, perhaps from a more psychological level, and that is basically your character or your personality. Now, you have to understand that if you're a psychology student, you probably confirm with what I'm trying to say here, is that your personality to some extent is basically fixed. And there's not much that you can do that you could change your specific foundation of your personality. There are always specific areas you can change, and I'll elaborate on these in just a moment now. But even Carl Jung, right, the famous philosopher, talks about the shadow theory, right? You've probably heard about this, the shadow theory. So you having basically a specific deep architecture of personality of who you really are. And it's quite scary if you read a little bit more about this. But basically, Carl Jung talks about you having a foundation of personality, and it's something that's not really changeable. So basically, it stays constant. But there are a few stuff that do change, right? Especially over a certain period of time. Now, the first thing is your behavior. Now, for the majority of us, if you guys are young, right? I assume that you guys are young as well. This behavior changes really, really often. Like, for example, tomorrow you are the happiest person in the room. The next day or even the next hour you are the angriest and you're moody. Suddenly you have fluctuations in how you feel, and then moments later you decide to do something completely different on what you plan to do. And so basically that boils down to behavior. And behavior is often, or not often, is literally stimulated by your environment, right? And so, in other words, it's something that you can't change, because the environment is the exterior, and the environment is that is changing. So environment is the thing that is changing, but you are essentially the same, right? From a first principle understanding. And so what you do is that basically you adjust your behavior to the environment. The environment doesn't adjust the environment to your behavior. It's more the opposite, right? And that specifically also talks about the Darwinian theory, right? Charles Darwin the theory of evolution. I don't want to elaborate on this too much, but let's just do theory of evolution, survival of the fittest. Evolution, I'll just call survival theory. And so the survival theory basically explains that, or the survival of the fittest essentially describes that you are basically a composition of specific set of personalities that have helped you survive until now, right? Because if you think about it, the reason why you're alive today is because your ancestors have equipped themselves with the right sets of belief systems, characters, behaviors, and attitude that basically allowed them to survive until now. I know that is an extreme example, but just bear with me for now, right? And so behavior is basically what could change daily, right? And so if you have a specific behavior for a certain amount of time, like for example a week, eventually that becomes an attitude, right? For example, you had a shitty week, literally 3, 4, 5 days in a row you had a horrible week. I don't know, your boss pissed you off, or I don't know, your girlfriend's giving you a hard time, or you're just messing up for some reason. Eventually that could develop into a specific attitude. Now there are more extreme examples of how attitude changes. For example, you have traumas. You have specific life-changing events that could shift your specific attitude. But attitude also, like behavior, changes, right? So what doesn't change, or what takes a whole lot amount of time to change, is basically your temperament. And so when it comes to the entire belief system and emulating what these millionaire people does, is you would like to understand that you want to emulate specific behaviors and attitudes that will eventually formulate if not a similar temperament like the millionaires. And I'll give you a specific example if you're confused of what I'm trying to explain here. Is, for example, in my career, right, me becoming a professional football player, the reason why I was able to get that far, to some extent, to where I am now, is because I was basically emulating or mimicking or reflecting the specific types of personalities, attitudes, and even temperaments of what other people who are professional football players did. And so basically what I did was I reverse engineered what they did, and I basically applied that in my own magical soup. And so with that being said, this is in a nutshell the social learning theory, right? And there are 100 different ways I could elaborate this even more, but I won't, because I want to keep it simple, and maybe to the best of my knowledge, I'm unable to, right? But from what I understood it so far, I've applied the social learning theory in multiple areas of my life, not only professional football, but my studies and my other stuff of, business or whatever not. I've emulated, or I've basically applied the social learning theory in many different areas, and it has helped me. So if you want to become a millionaire or successful in other areas of life, understand the social learning theory and start by literally eating, breathing, and thinking how these millionaires do. And with that, your chances of succeeding is literally higher. Goodbye.